June 19, 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 8 hours of combat, American F-6F Hellcats destroyed 480 Japanese aircraft while losing only 33 of their own. The kill ratio was 14-1. It was the most decisive air battle in history. Lieutenant Alexander Vatu shot down 6 aircraft in 8 minutes, while his wings were barely attached to his plane. Commander David McCampbell claimed 7 victories in a single day. Fighting Squadron 1 from Yorktown destroyed 37 enemy aircraft. The sky over the Philippine Sea became a killing field. The Japanese had committed everything. 430 aircraft from 9 carriers launched in 4 massive waves. Fewer than 100 returned. The survivors told stories of horror. Hellcats everywhere, attacking from all directions. Impossible to fight, impossible to escape. 2 of Japan's newest carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, were sunk by American submarines. At 15:32 hours, Taiho exploded from accumulated fuel vapors, killing 1,650 men. Admiral Ozawa transferred his flag to a destroyer and watched his fleet disintegrate. By sunset on the 19th, Japanese naval aviation had been destroyed as an effective force. The myth of zero superiority was over. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt, but Admiral Mitscher wasn't finished. 6 Japanese carriers had survived. They were fleeing west. If they escaped, they could be reinforced, could fight again, could extend the war. They had to be found, had to be destroyed. At 15:40 hours on June 20th, search planes spotted them, 275 miles away. Extreme range, late afternoon. Launching a strike now meant the pilots would return after dark. Many would run out of fuel. Many would die. Mitscher gave the order anyway. Launch them. What happened next would test American pilots to their absolute limit, would force an admiral to make the most controversial decision of his career, and would prove that sometimes leadership meant breaking every rule to bring your people home. This is part 2. The sun was high and merciless over the Philippine Sea when Commander Charles Brewer spotted the formation of Zeros orbiting Guam at 15,000 feet. They were waiting to land, low on fuel after the morning's disaster, hoping to refuel and rearm before attempting the flight back to their carriers. Brewer had been flying combat air patrol over the task force when the fighter director vectored his division toward the island. The voice in his headset was calm and professional. Blue Leader, this is Charlie Base, bogies orbiting a rote field, Angels 15, Vector 270 and intercept, cleared to engage. Brewer acknowledged and turned his Hellcat west. This was the 6th sortie of the day for him. 6 launches, 6 landings, 6 refuelings, 6 times climbing back into the cockpit and going back to work. The Zeros saw them coming. They had no choice. They were low on fuel and ammunition. They were exhausted from hours of combat and the horror of watching their formations destroyed. But they were Japanese naval aviators, and they would fight. They turned to meet the Hellcats. It was the last decision some of them would ever make. Brewer's division dove through them from above with the sun behind them. Brewer selected a Zero. The Japanese pilot saw him coming, turned to meet the threat. It was the wrong decision. The Zero's turning advantage meant nothing when the Hellcat attacked from above with superior speed. Brewer's guns converged. The Zero came apart. He pulled up, looking for another target, found one climbing desperately for altitude. The second Zero never reached safety. Brewer's burst caught it perfectly. Explosion. 2 kills in 30 seconds. But one of the Zeros was flown by a veteran, a pilot who had survived since the early days of the war, a man who understood that courage without tactics was suicide, but sometimes courage was all you had left. He positioned his Zero behind Brewer's Hellcat during the pull-up from the second kill. The moment when Brewer was focused on scanning for more targets, the moment when his speed was low and his attention was divided, the Zero's guns found their mark. 20mm cannon shells walked across Brewer's Hellcat. The first hit the engine. The second hit the cockpit area. The armor stopped some of the shrapnel, but not all. Brewer slumped in his harness. The Hellcat nosed over, began the long fall toward the ocean below. His wingmen saw it happen, called his name on the radio. Brewer, Brewer, brake right. But there was no response. The Hellcat struck the water at high speed. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated on contact. No parachute, no survival raft, no sign that the commander had survived. The news reached Essex an hour later. Commander Charles Brewer, one of VF-15's most experienced leaders, was dead. He had shot down 3 enemy aircraft that morning, had led his squadron with skill and courage, and had died anyway because even in a turkey shoot, even when you held every advantage, war could still kill you. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley took command of VF-15, and the squadron continued its devastating effectiveness. There was no time to mourn, no time to process the loss. That would come later, when the battle was over and the adrenaline faded, and men could finally think about what they had seen and done. The afternoon missions over Guam and Rota were perhaps even more one-sided than the morning's carrier battle. Japanese aircraft attempting to land were caught at their most vulnerable, low on fuel, low on ammunition, slow and low, and focused on finding the runway. The Hellcats fell on them like wolves on wounded deer. VF-16's pilots flew mission after mission. Alexander Vatu launched twice more, adding 2 more kills to his morning tally, 8 victories in one day. His Hellcats' guns were so hot the barrels were starting to show stress. The armorers replaced all 6 guns between sorties, a job that normally took hours, but the crew accomplished in 30 minutes because they knew pilots were waiting. The logistics chain supporting the Hellcat was staggering in its scope and effectiveness. Fleet oilers delivered millions of gallons of aviation fuel to the carriers. Supply ships brought ammunition by the ton. Escort carriers positioned behind the task force carried replacement aircraft and pilots ready to be transferred forward. The mobile service squadrons could perform depot-level maintenance at forward bases. Each carrier had machine shops capable of manufacturing parts. Damaged engines were swapped out in hours. Entire wings could be replaced overnight. It was industrial warfare on a scale the Japanese couldn't match. Japan was running out of everything. Fuel quality had degraded so badly that engines couldn't produce rated power. Experienced workers had been drafted into the military. Manufacturing tolerances were slipping. The Zeros arriving at frontline units in 1944 were noticeably inferior to those built in 1942. The engines failed more often. The control surfaces didn't fit properly. The radios worked intermittently, if at all, and there were no spare parts to fix any of it. Maintenance crews cannibalized damaged aircraft to keep operational ones flying. It was a losing battle. The training disparity was even more critical than the equipment differences. American pilots arrived at their squadrons with 300 to 400 hours of flight time. They had practiced carrier landings dozens of times on training carriers where mistakes meant embarrassment rather than death. They had fired thousands of rounds in gunnery practice. They had flown formation until it was instinctive. They had practiced intercepts and defensive tactics until they could execute them half asleep. And most importantly, they had been taught by combat veterans who had rotated home specifically to pass on their experience. The rotation system was perhaps America's greatest advantage. Experienced pilots, like Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, went home to train new pilots. Their combat lessons were institutionalized, taught to every new pilot in training. Every mistake that had gotten someone killed was now part of the curriculum. Every successful tactic was documented and spread throughout the training system. The Americans were learning and adapting as an organization. Japan kept its veterans in combat until they died. The few who survived into 1944 were overwhelmed trying to lead inexperienced pilots against superior forces. Zenji Abe was typical, a Pearl Harbor veteran with years of combat experience, an excellent pilot by any standard. But what good was his experience when he was leading formations of boys who could barely fly their aircraft? The communications advantage multiplied every other American advantage. VHF radios Using standardized terminology meant pilots could coordinate attacks, warn each other of threats, maintain situational awareness even in the chaos of combat. Break right, Blue 2, 0 on your 6. Roger, breaking right. Thanks, lead. Those few words could save a life. The Japanese radios were unreliable when they worked at all. Many pilots removed them to save weight, relying on hand signals impossible to see in combat. They fought as individuals and died as individuals. By 1400 hours, the scope of Japan's defeat was becoming clear even to Admiral Ozawa. His carriers had launched every available aircraft in 4 massive waves. Fewer than 100 had returned. The returning pilots told stories of horror. Hellcats everywhere, impossible numbers, attacking from all directions. No way to fight them, no way to escape. Some pilots were in shock, unable to speak coherently. Others wept openly. A few sat in silence, staring at nothing, their minds unable to process what they had experienced. On Taiho, the fuel vapors had been spreading for 7 hours. The ship was a floating bomb, and at 15:32 hours, the spark finally found the vapor. The explosion was catastrophic. It started deep in the ship and propagated through every compartment connected to the ventilation system. Bulkheads collapsed, decks buckled. The hangar deck erupted in a fireball that consumed everything. The flight deck lifted several feet before settling back, twisted and broken. The island structure toppled. Men were incinerated instantly or crushed by collapsing steel or blown overboard by the blast. Admiral Ozawa was thrown across the bridge but survived. He transferred his flag to the destroyer Wakatsuki and continued to command the fleet. But Taiho was gone. The newest carrier in the Japanese Navy sank within hours, taking 1,650 men with her. The news spread through the fleet like a shockwave. First Shokaku, now Taiho. 2 of Japan's newest and largest carriers gone in one day. The Americans had sunk them without even finding the Japanese fleet. Submarines had done what the carrier aircraft had failed to do. The irony was bitter. Japan had developed the concepts of carrier warfare, had proven at Pearl Harbor that carriers were the dominant naval weapon. Now, those same carriers were being systematically destroyed by an enemy who had learned those lessons and improved on them. The afternoon wore on. More American fighters flew more sorties. More Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The total for June 19th would reach 480 aircraft when land-based planes were included. It was the single most devastating day for any air force in the history of aerial warfare. And the psychological impact was perhaps even more significant than the physical losses. Every surviving Japanese pilot now knew the Hellcat was superior, knew that engaging one meant probable death. That knowledge spread through Japanese naval aviation like a disease. Morale collapsed. Many pilots began viewing every mission as suicide, even before the formal adoption of kamikaze tactics. The Hellcat hadn't just defeated them in combat, it had broken their spirit. Lieutenant Commander William Killer Kane, commanding Air Group 10 from Enterprise, flew sorties on both June 19th and 20th. In his diary that night, he wrote, "The greatest air defeat suffered by any nation ever." Kane had started the war flying obsolete aircraft against superior Japanese pilots. He had survived through skill and luck. Now he commanded squadrons equipped with the best fighter in the world, flown by superbly trained pilots, directed by radar controllers who could see everything. The transformation was complete. The sunset over the Philippine Sea was spectacular. The sky turned orange and red and purple. On the decks of the American carriers, pilots who had flown 4 or 5 or 6 sorties climbed wearily from their Hellcats and walked to debriefing. They were exhausted. Some were wounded. All were affected by what they had experienced. The young pilots who had claimed their first victories tried to feel triumphant, but mostly felt numb. The veterans who had been killing for months or years felt nothing at all. That numbness was how you survived. In the ready rooms, intelligence officers recorded claims. Gun camera footage was reviewed. Witnesses were questioned. The final tallies would take days to confirm, but the rough numbers were clear. American pilots were claiming over 300 carrier aircraft destroyed plus another 150 land-based aircraft. American losses were 33 aircraft and 26 personnel. The kill ratio was approximately 10-1. Admiral Ozawa sat in Wakatsuki's tiny wardroom and tried to compose his report to Admiral Toyota. How did you explain losing 350 aircraft in one day? How did you justify losing 2 carriers to submarines while failing to inflict significant damage on the enemy? Ozawa was a professional. He would write the report honestly, would take responsibility, would not make excuses. But he knew his career was over. The Bushido Code demanded that he accept the consequences of failure. But Ozawa also knew something that his superiors might not want to hear. The battle had proven that Japan could not win the war. The Americans had too many ships, too many aircraft, too many trained pilots. They had better technology, better training, better systems. And most importantly, they had the industrial capacity to replace losses that Japan could never match. The mathematics were unsustainable. Japan was drowning in American material superiority, and courage couldn't overcome that reality. Alexander Vatu sat in VF-16's ready room and stared at his hands. They had finally stopped shaking. 8 victories in one day. That made him an ace several times over. The press would want interviews. The photographers had already taken dozens of pictures. But Vatu wasn't thinking about fame or glory. He was thinking about those 8 Japanese pilots. Were they dead? Almost certainly. Had they suffered? Probably not. The Hellcats' guns killed quickly, but they had been men like him, had families like him, and he had killed them because that was his job. He would do it again tomorrow, if ordered. But sitting in the quiet ready room with the day's violence finally over, he couldn't stop thinking about the human cost. Commander David McCampbell was writing his after-action report. 7 victories confirmed, 5 Judy dive bombers in the morning, 2 Zeros over Guam in the afternoon. That brought his total to 19 kills. He was well on his way to becoming the Navy's leading ace. But the report didn't capture what the day had really been like. Didn't convey the chaos of combat, the confusion, the fear mixed with excitement. War was too complex for official reports, too human, too messy. Admiral Mitscher stood on Lexington's bridge and looked at the dark ocean. Somewhere out there, Ozawa's surviving carriers were retreating. Search planes had been looking for them all day, but the Japanese fleet had remained elusive. Tomorrow they would try again, would launch everything at maximum range, would attempt to finish what the submarines had started. It would be risky. The pilots would be flying to the absolute limit of their range. Many would not have enough fuel to return. But the chance to destroy the Japanese carrier fleet was too important to pass up. Mitscher made his decision. Tomorrow they would go hunting, and whatever the cost, they would finish the job. The night was quiet except for the sound of the sea and the ship's machinery. Men tried to sleep, but many couldn't. The adrenaline was still coursing through their systems. The images of the day's combat kept replaying in their minds. But one thing was certain. June 19th, 1944, had marked a turning point. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had demonstrated beyond any doubt that American naval aviation was superior to Japanese in every measurable way. The Hellcat had proven itself the most successful fighter aircraft in naval history, and Japanese naval aviation had been dealt a blow from which it would never recover. Dawn on June the 20th came with uncertainty. The search planes launched in darkness, their engines roaring as they catapulted into the pre-dawn gloom, spreading out in wide arcs to cover thousands of square miles of empty ocean. Somewhere to the west, Admiral Ozawa's surviving carriers were running. 6 carriers remained operational after Taiho and Shokaku had gone down. Those 6 carriers represented Japan's last chance at meaningful naval aviation capability. If they escaped, they could be reinforced, rearmed, sent back into action. But if they could be found and destroyed today, Japanese carrier aviation would be finished as an effective force. The question was simple. Could the search planes find them before they steamed out of range? Lieutenant Robert Nelson from Enterprise was 3 hours into his search when he spotted the wakes. At first, they were just white lines against the dark blue water, barely visible in the morning haze. Then the shapes resolved. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, the entire Japanese fleet spread across miles of ocean. Nelson checked his navigation. They were 275 miles west of Task Force 58. That was extreme range for a strike, the absolute limit of what American carrier aircraft could manage. And it was already 1540 hours. Launching a strike now meant the aircraft would return after dark. Many would run out of fuel. Pilots would have to land on carriers at night, one of the most dangerous operations in naval aviation. Some would die simply from fuel exhaustion or landing accidents, even if no Japanese fighters opposed them. But this was the chance Admiral Mitscher had been waiting for. Nelson broke radio silence and transmitted the contact report. His voice was calm, professional, betraying none of the excitement he felt. Big Base, this is Search 2 Baker. Enemy fleet located bearing 270, distance 275 miles. Course 040, speed 20 knots. Count 6 carriers, multiple battleships and cruisers. The message was received immediately aboard Lexington. Mitscher was on the flag bridge within seconds, studying the plot. 275 miles. He knew what that meant, knew the risks, knew that men would die even if the attack succeeded. But he also knew this might be the only chance to finish the Japanese carrier force. He made his decision without hesitation. Launch them. At 24 hours, Task Force 58 began launching aircraft, 216 planes, 85 Hellcats providing fighter cover, 77 dive bombers carrying 1,000-pound bombs, 54 torpedo bombers with their deadly fish. Every pilot knew the fuel situation before they launched. They had briefed the numbers. They understood the mathematics. Cruise out at economical power. Attack as quickly as possible. Cruise back at minimum fuel consumption. Hope the winds were favorable. Hope the navigation was perfect. Hope nothing went wrong. And hope there was enough fuel left when they reached the task force to find a carrier and land. It was a desperate gamble, but the alternative was letting the Japanese fleet escape. Lieutenant Commander James D. Jigdog Ramage led Bombing Squadron 10 from Enterprise. His dauntless dive bomber was loaded with a 1,000-pound bomb that reduced his range even further. He did the calculations in his head as he formed up his squadron and turned west. Maximum range with this load was about 300 miles. They would be flying 275 miles out. That left 25 miles margin, except that assumed perfect navigation, no combat maneuvering, no time spent searching for targets, and favorable winds on the return. Any one of those assumptions being wrong meant running out of fuel short of the carriers. Ramage accepted the risk because that was his job. The flight out took nearly 2 hours. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon. The fuel gauges were dropping too. Every pilot watched his gauge obsessively, calculating range and fuel consumption, trying to determine if he had enough to make it back. Some pilots were already in trouble. The winds had been worse than forecast, but they pressed on because turning back now meant the entire mission was wasted. At 1840 hours, the American formations spotted the Japanese fleet. The carriers were in the center of a protective ring of battleships and cruisers. Destroyers formed an outer screen. It was a defensive formation designed to maximize anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese knew they had been found, knew the attack was coming. The few remaining fighters scrambled to intercept, perhaps 30 Zeros and a handful of other types. They were all that remained of the 430 aircraft Ozawa had sortied with 2 days earlier. The Hellcats went after them immediately. The dogfight that developed was brief and one-sided. The Japanese pilots were exhausted, low on ammunition, flying damaged aircraft. The American pilots were fresh, confident, flying superior fighters. Within minutes, most of the Japanese fighters were either shot down or fleeing. The sky belonged to the Americans. Ramage pushed over into his dive. The Dauntless fell toward the carrier below, gaining speed, the wind screaming past the canopy. At 6,000 feet, he centered the carrier in his sight. The anti-aircraft fire was intense. Black puffs of exploding shells surrounded his aircraft. Tracers arced up from the ships below. The proximity-fused shells were devastating. Ramage ignored the fire, focused on his sight picture. At 3,000 feet, he released his bomb and pulled out hard. The G-forces crushed him into his seat. His vision grayed at the edges. The Dauntless groaned under the strain, but held together. He leveled off at 1,000 feet and looked back. The bomb had hit near the carrier's stern. Fire and smoke erupted from the impact point. The carrier was Hiyo. She took multiple bomb and torpedo hits during the attack. The damage was catastrophic. Fires spread out of control. The engine rooms flooded. By evening, she would sink. The carrier Zuikaku took several hits, but remained afloat. Junyo was damaged. Chiyoda was damaged. The battleship Haruna took a bomb hit. 2 oilers were sunk. The attack lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Then, the American aircraft turned east and began the long flight home. And that's when the real crisis began. The sun was setting as the formations turned for home. The sky was turning orange and red, beautiful and deadly because darkness was coming fast, and with it came disorientation and fuel exhaustion and all the dangers of night flying over water. The pilots settled into cruise power, leaning their fuel mixtures to absolute minimum, nursing every gallon. But the mathematics were unforgiving. Some aircraft simply didn't have enough fuel to make it back. The first aircraft ran out of fuel at 20-30 hours. The pilot's voice on the radio was calm. "This is Blue 7. Engine quit. Going in." Then silence. The Hellcat fell toward the dark water below and disappeared. Other pilots heard the transmission and checked their own gauges and saw their own futures. More engines quit. More aircraft ditched. The radio filled with calls. Red 3 ditching. Send help. White 4 going in. Mark my position. The voices were professional, but the fear underneath was unmistakable. Lieutenant Commander John Gray of VF-18 watched his fuel gauge drop below the reserve mark. His calculations said he would run out approximately 20 miles short of the task force. He began looking for alternatives. He could ditch near one of the returning bombers and hope the bomber's crew saw him. Or he could try to stretch his fuel by flying at absolute minimum power and hope he made it. He chose to press on. The engine kept running. The needle kept dropping. The ocean below was completely black now. No moon, no stars visible through clouds. If he had to ditch, he wouldn't even see the water before he hit it. On Lexington's flag bridge, Admiral Mitscher was receiving reports of aircraft ditching. The numbers were climbing. 10 aircraft down, 15, 20. His staff was tracking the losses, trying to calculate how many would make it back. The situation was becoming critical. Pilots were running out of fuel faster than anticipated. And now, men were dying not from enemy action, but from simple fuel exhaustion. Mitscher stood silently, watching the dark ocean, making calculations of his own. Finally, he turned to his chief of staff and gave an order that would become one of the most famous decisions in naval history. "Turn on the lights." The chief of staff hesitated. Turning on the lights meant illuminating every ship in Task Force 58. It meant making the fleet visible to any Japanese submarines that might be hunting in the area. It meant violating every blackout procedure, every security protocol, every lesson learned about night operations in hostile waters. A single submarine could sink a carrier. The lights would make that job easier. But Mitscher's decision was final. "Turn on the lights. I'll take responsibility." The order went out by radio and signal flag. Within minutes, every ship in Task Force 58 was illuminated. Searchlights pointed skyward. Flight deck lights blazed. Recognition lights flashed. Star shells were fired into the air, bursting and drifting down on parachutes, casting harsh white light across miles of ocean. It was surreal, impossible. Task Force 58 had become a city of lights in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Times Square floating on the water. Every carrier's flight deck lit up like a stage. Gray saw the lights from 30 miles away. At first, just a glow on the horizon. Then, individual lights resolving. Searchlights, flight deck lights, ships outlined in light. He couldn't believe it. The task force was illuminating for them, showing them the way home. His engine was running on fumes. The fuel gauge showed empty, but the lights were right there. He pushed his throttle forward slightly, trading the altitude for speed, gliding toward the nearest carrier. The engine quit 2 miles from Lexington. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Gray trimmed for best glide and aimed for the flight deck. He couldn't reach Lexington, but he could reach Yorktown. He made a dead-stick approach. No engine, just momentum and hope. The deck rushed up. He caught the number 3 wire, the tailhook engaged. The Hellcat went from flying to stopped. Gray sat in the cockpit shaking. He had made it. The recovery was chaos. Aircraft landed on any available deck. Pilots from Enterprise landed on Hornet. Pilots from Essex landed on Bunker Hill. Some misjudged their approaches and crashed on landing, blocking flight decks. The crash crews worked frantically, clearing wreckage, making room for more aircraft. Some pilots ditched alongside carriers, their engines quitting on final approach. The destroyers moved in immediately, searchlights sweeping the water, finding pilots, pulling them from the sea. Of the 216 aircraft launched, 80 were lost, most to fuel exhaustion, some to operational accidents during the night recovery. But 49 aircrew killed or missing was significantly less than it could have been. Without Mitscher's decision to illuminate the fleet, the losses would have been catastrophic. Perhaps half the strike force would have been lost. Instead, most of the pilots survived, would fly again, would fight again. Commander William Killer Kane wrote in his diary that night, "Mitscher took a hell of a risk lighting up the fleet, but he saved a lot of good men. That's the kind of leader men will follow anywhere." The sentiment was widespread throughout the task force. The pilots knew what the Admiral had risked for them, knew that he had put the entire fleet in danger to bring them home. That knowledge created a bond between commander and commanded that went beyond duty or discipline. The last aircraft landed at 22:45 hours. The deck crews began the recovery operations immediately, pushing damaged aircraft over the side to clear deck space, refueling those that could be salvaged, rearming guns. The work continued through the night, because tomorrow there might be more missions. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. 2 days of combat had resulted in the destruction of Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. Approximately 600 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 3 carriers sunk, several more damaged. Nearly all the remaining trained carrier pilots killed or too traumatized to fight effectively. American losses were 123 aircraft, mostly from fuel exhaustion on the 20th. The kill ratio was overwhelming. The victory was complete. Admiral Ozawa's surviving carriers limped back toward Japan with empty flight decks and shattered air groups. The Admiral knew his career was finished, knew he had failed in his mission to destroy the American fleet. But he also knew the failure wasn't his fault. Japan had sent him to fight with inadequate resources, poorly trained pilots, obsolete tactics. The Americans had every advantage, and they had used those advantages with devastating efficiency. Mitscher stood on Lexington's bridge as the last aircraft was recovered. His staff was celebrating the victory, but the Admiral showed little emotion. He had won the battle, had destroyed the Japanese carrier threat. But the cost troubled him. 80 aircraft lost, 49 men dead or missing. Could he have done something differently? The second guessing was pointless. He had made the best decisions he could with the information available. The night illumination had saved lives. The attack had been necessary. The victory was decisive. Alexander Vatu was finally able to write a letter home. He couldn't say much because of censorship, couldn't describe the combat or the losses or the fear, but he could tell his family he was safe, that he was doing his job, that he missed them. The words seemed inadequate. The censors would read his letter and cross out anything that might compromise security. His family would receive a heavily edited version that told them nothing meaningful. But at least they would know he was alive. The night was quiet except for the sound of the sea and the machinery. Men tried to sleep, but many couldn't. The adrenaline was still there. The images were still vivid. Combat was full of what-ifs, and dwelling on them was pointless. But the human mind couldn't help asking the questions. As dawn approached on June 21st, Task Force 58 turned east. The mission was complete. Saipan was secured. The Japanese carriers were destroyed or fleeing. American air superiority was absolute. But the real story wasn't just about June 19th and 20th. It was about what came next. About whether the Hellcats' dominance would continue. About whether one pilot flying one mission 4 months later would prove that the Turkey Shoot wasn't an anomaly. It was a preview. 4 months later, that question would be answered. October 24th, 1944, 4 months after the Philippine Sea. The war had moved closer to Japan. The Americans had taken Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The Philippines were next, and the largest naval battle in history was developing in the waters around Leyte Gulf. Commander David McCampbell, now the air group commander aboard USS Essex with 34 confirmed kills, launched on what should have been a routine combat air patrol. He had no way of knowing that the next 90 minutes would cement his reputation as the greatest naval aviator in American history. The morning had started early. McCampbell and his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, had been airborne since 0700 hours, orbiting over the task force at 20,000 feet. It was boring work. Hours of flying in circles, scanning empty sky, waiting for something that might never happen. But at 0845 hours, the radio crackled with a transmission that changed everything. Charlie Base to all fighters. Large enemy formation approaching from the west. Angels 18, all available fighters intercept. McCampbell turned his Hellcat west and climbed for altitude. Rushing stayed glued to his wing. The two fighters accelerated toward combat speed. The fighter director's voice continued providing vectors. Bogey is now bearing 270. Distance 40 miles. Count 60 plus aircraft. McCampbell did the mathematics. 60 plus Japanese aircraft. 2 American Hellcats. The odds were suicidal, but the Japanese formation was heading for the carriers. If they got through, they could sink ships and kill thousands of men. Someone had to stop them, and right now someone meant McCampbell and Rushing. At 30 miles, McCampbell spotted them. A massive formation, flying in precise V's and echelons, Zeros and Oscars providing fighter cover, Judy dive bombers and Jill torpedo bombers carrying the ordnance that could sink carriers. They were flying straight and level at 18,000 feet, completely unaware that 2 Hellcats were closing from above and behind. McCampbell keyed his radio. 2 aircraft versus 60. We can't stop them all, but we can slow them down. Hit and run. Stay fast. Don't get trapped. Rushing acknowledged. The 2 Hellcats positioned for their first pass. McCampbell selected a target. One of the bombers on the formation's edge. He rolled in from above, the Hellcat accelerating in the dive, the range closing rapidly. At 400 yards, he pressed the trigger. All 6 guns opened fire. The bomber shuddered under the impacts and fell away, trailing smoke. McCampbell didn't watch it die. He was already pulling up, looking for the next target. Rushing had gotten one too. 2 bombers down, 58 to go. The Japanese formation hadn't broken, hadn't scattered. They maintained their positions like they were on parade. It was exactly what McCampbell had hoped for. Disciplined formations made predictable targets. He positioned for another pass, dove from above, selected a target, fired. Another bomber exploded. He pulled up and away before the escorts could react. 3 down, the pattern repeated. Dive, fire, kill, climb. The Hellcat's speed and altitude advantage let McCampbell dictate the terms completely. He would attack from above, use gravity and engine power to build speed, make one quick pass, and be gone before the escorts could intercept. The Zeros tried to follow, but they couldn't match the Hellcat's dive performance. 4 bombers down, 5, 6. At kill 7, McCampbell selected an Oscar fighter that was trying to position on Rushing. The Japanese pilot was good, turning inside Rushing's Hellcat, working for a firing solution. McCampbell dove on him from above. The Oscar never saw him coming. The 650s converged. The Oscar disintegrated. Rushing transmitted his thanks. McCampbell was already looking for the next target. 8 kills. A Zero this time, flying alone, separated from its formation. At flight, McCampbell caught it in a climbing turn. The Zero tried to reverse, but McCampbell anticipated the move and was already there. Short burst. The Zero exploded. McCampbell checked his ammunition. Running low now. Maybe enough for 1 or 2 more kills. He scanned the sky for threats and targets simultaneously. Found a Judy dive bomber trying to escape at low altitude. Followed it down. The Judy's rear gunner was firing, but the tracers passed harmlessly wide. McCampbell closed to point-blank range, pressed the trigger. His guns fired briefly, then went silent. Out of ammunition. But the brief burst had been enough. The Judy rolled inverted and hit the water. 9 kills in 1 mission. McCampbell keyed his radio. Winchester, heading home. Rushing acknowledged that he too was out of ammunition. 6 more kills for the wingman. 15 aircraft between 2 pilots. The remaining Japanese formation was scattered, disorganized, no longer a coordinated threat. Other Hellcats were arriving now, vectored in by the fighter directors. They would finish the job. The flight back took 30 minutes. McCampbell used the time to process what had just happened. 9 aircraft destroyed, 9 Japanese pilots dead. It was a record. No American pilot had ever shot down 9 aircraft in a single mission. But McCampbell wasn't thinking about records or glory. He was thinking about the mechanics of combat, the geometry of the attacks, the split-second decisions. Combat flying was like playing chess at 300 miles per hour while someone was shooting at you. 1 mistake meant death. He had made no mistakes, had maintained perfect discipline, and 9 men were dead because of it. Landing on Essex at 10:15 hours, the plane captain climbed up to the cockpit. "How'd it go, Commander?" McCampbell held up 9 fingers. The plane captain's eyes went wide. 9? Yes, 9 confirmed. The word spread through the deck crew instantly. The photographers were there before McCampbell could climb out. The intelligence officers wanted his debriefing. The squadron mates wanted to hear the story. McCampbell endured it all with quiet professionalism. But later, alone in his quarters, McCampbell wrote in his diary, 9 kills, new Navy record. Feel more tired than proud. Killing is never easy, even when necessary. The Hellcat made the difference. Without it, Rushing and I would be dead. Instead, we stopped a major attack and came home. That is what matters. Lieutenant Roy Rushing had his own perspective on the mission. He later told reporters that McCampbell had flown the most perfect combat mission he had ever witnessed. Every move calculated, every shot placed with precision, no wasted motion, no wasted ammunition. It was like watching a master craftsman at work. The mission proved several things that the Philippine Sea had already suggested. The Hellcat's technical superiority was so overwhelming that skilled pilots could achieve results that seemed impossible. 2 fighters stopping a formation of 60 wasn't tactics or luck. It was pure performance advantage. The Hellcat could engage and disengage at will, could attack from positions where the Japanese couldn't counterattack, could absorb damage that would destroy lighter fighters. The Battle of Leyte Gulf raged for 3 more days. It became the largest naval battle in history. The Americans won decisively. Japanese surface forces were shattered. Their carrier force, already decimated at Philippine Sea, was used as a decoy and effectively destroyed. The kamikazes made their first appearance, desperate pilots flying suicide missions because conventional attacks had proven so ineffective. McCampbell continued flying missions throughout the battle, added more kills to his tally. By the time Leyte Gulf ended, he had 34 confirmed victories, all in Hellcats, all using the same tactics: altitude advantage, speed advantage, hit and run. The Hellcat made those tactics possible. October 24, 1944 had proven that 4 months after Philippine Sea, the Hellcat still dominated. The Japanese had learned nothing that could counter American technical and tactical superiority. The mathematics were too heavily stacked against them. No amount of courage or warrior spirit could overcome those accumulated advantages. As 1944 turned to 1945, the Hellcat would continue its reign over Pacific skies, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the final raids on Japan itself. Every campaign would see Hellcats flying top cover, shooting down whatever opposition appeared, achieving air superiority so complete that American bombers and attack aircraft could operate almost without interference. The dark blue fighter with the white star had become a symbol of American air power, and it all traced back to the design decisions Grumman had made years earlier. But the story wasn't just about the aircraft. It was about what that aircraft represented, about systems and training and industrial might, about the complete package of American military power applied to warfare. The legacy of that system would shape conflicts for generations to come. The numbers told a story that no amount of propaganda could distort. By the time Japan surrendered on September 2nd, 1945, F-6F Hellcats had flown 66,530 combat sorties. They had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. They had lost only 270 Hellcats to enemy fighters. The kill ratio of 19-1 wasn't American exaggeration. It was documented fact confirmed by Japanese records captured after the war. Historians from both nations working with access to complete files from both sides verified the numbers. The Hellcat had achieved the most dominant performance of any fighter aircraft in history, but statistics couldn't capture what that dominance meant, couldn't explain how one aircraft had broken the back of Japanese naval aviation, couldn't convey the psychological impact of facing an enemy fighter that was faster, tougher, and deadlier than anything you could field. The Hellcat had done more than win battles. It had destroyed the myth of Japanese air superiority so completely that by 1945, Japanese pilots viewed every mission as suicide. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had built 12,275 Hellcats between 1942 and 1945. Peak production reached 500 aircraft per month. Every single one was identical. Every part was completely interchangeable. A Hellcat built in 1943 used exactly the same components as one built in 1945. That standardization made maintenance simple and logistics efficient. This was American mass production applied to warfare, and it worked with devastating efficiency. The Japanese, by contrast, still partially hand-built aircraft in 1944. Each Zero was slightly different from every other Zero. Quality varied depending on which factory produced the aircraft. Manufacturing tolerances slipped, engines produced less power than rated, and there were no standardized spare parts. Maintenance became a nightmare of improvisation and cannibalization. The contrast extended beyond manufacturing to the entire system of warfare. American pilots arrived at their squadrons with 300 to 400 hours of flight training. They knew their aircraft intimately. They had fired thousands of rounds in gunnery practice, and if they were shot down, massive rescue efforts would attempt to save them. Japanese pilots by 1944 arrived with 50 to 100 hours total flight time. Many had never fired their guns in training, and if shot down, they were on their own. The rotation system multiplied American advantages exponentially. Combat veterans returned home to train new pilots. Their hard-won experience was institutionalized, taught to every student, incorporated into doctrine. The Japanese kept their veterans in combat until they died. By mid-1944, almost all the Pearl Harbor and Midway veterans were gone. The knowledge they had accumulated died with them. The design philosophy behind the Hellcat influenced every American fighter that followed. The F-8F Bearcat, the P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, even jet fighters like the F-86 Sabre, incorporated lessons learned from the Hellcat's success. American aircraft design had shifted permanently toward the concept that pilot protection was paramount. That firepower mattered more than maneuverability. That being able to take damage and keep fighting was more valuable than being light and agile. The Japanese clung to their old philosophy until the end. The final variants of the Zero tried to match American performance by adding armor and self-sealing tanks, but those additions ruined the aircraft's handling characteristics. It became a mediocre fighter that was neither maneuverable nor tough. The late-war Japanese fighters like the Kowanishian 1K George and the Kawasaki Ki-100 were actually excellent designs that could compete with American fighters on more equal terms. But they arrived too late and in too few numbers. Japan couldn't mass-produce them, couldn't maintain them properly, couldn't train enough pilots to fly them effectively. The Battle of the Philippine Sea remained the turning point. June 19th and 20th, 1944, were the days when Japanese naval aviation died. Everything after was just aftermath. The kamikazes were an admission of defeat, a recognition that conventional attacks couldn't succeed. But kamikaze attacks achieved some tactical successes without changing strategic realities. America's industrial power was too great. For every ship the kamikazes sank, 10 more arrived. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa survived the war. In post-war interviews, he spoke with remarkable candor about what had happened at Philippine Sea. He acknowledged that the battle marked the end of Japanese carrier aviation, admitted that American pilot training and the F-6F Hellcat had proven decisive, recognized that Japanese tactics and strategy had been inadequate against American technical and systemic superiority. Commander David McCampbell ended the war with 34 confirmed victories, all achieved while flying Hellcats. He received the Medal of Honor, became the Navy's all-time leading ace. But in later interviews, McCampbell consistently deflected credit from himself to his aircraft. "The Hellcat made the difference," he would say. "Without that aircraft, I would have died in my first combat. Instead, I survived the entire war and came home. That's what matters." Lieutenant Alexander Vatu survived the war with 19 confirmed victories. The photograph of him holding up 6 fingers after his legendary mission became one of the iconic images of American naval aviation. After the war, he rarely spoke about his combat experiences. The killing had affected him in ways he couldn't articulate. He had done his duty, had served his country, but there was no glory in it for him, just the knowledge that he had survived when so many others hadn't. The Hellcat continued in service after the war. Some were converted to night fighters with radar. Some were used for training. A few remained in active service with reserve squadrons into the 1950s. But the jet age was coming, and propeller fighters were obsolete. The Hellcat had been designed for a specific war at a specific time, and it had dominated that war completely. But its legacy remained. The aircraft had proven that systematic engineering excellence could overcome individual warrior skill, that industrial production could overwhelm craft tradition, that protecting your pilots let them survive to become veterans who could train the next generation. These lessons shaped American military aviation permanently. Grumman built a reputation on the Hellcat that sustained the company for decades. The Bearcat, the Panther Jet, the Cougar, the Tiger, the Intruder, the Tomcat. Each successive aircraft carried the legacy of the Hellcat's design philosophy. Grumman fighters were tough, were built to bring pilots home. The human cost of the war could never be fully calculated. Every kill ratio represented men who died. Every victory celebration was built on the bodies of defeated enemies. The Americans had won through superior technology and industrial might, but they had still sent thousands of pilots into combat and hundreds had died. The Japanese had lost even more catastrophically. Tens of thousands of pilots killed, an entire generation of young men destroyed. The veterans of Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf and the other Pacific battles came home to parades and celebrations, were treated as heroes. Most tried to resume normal lives, got jobs, raised families, tried to forget what they had seen and done. Some succeeded. Others never stopped seeing the burning aircraft and falling pilots in their dreams. But they had won, had defeated an enemy that seemed invincible in 1942, had helped save the world from tyranny. Japan's conquests in Asia had killed millions. American victory had ended that, had liberated millions, had restored freedom to nations that had lost it. The cost had been terrible, but the cause had been just. The Hellcat had been central to that victory, had achieved air superiority so complete that American forces could operate almost without opposition, had protected the carriers that protected the invasion forces, had shot down the bombers that would have sunk ships and killed thousands. And it had done that work with such overwhelming effectiveness that the outcome was never really in doubt after mid-1944. The final missions were flown in August 1945. Hellcats provided top cover for the final carrier strikes against Japan. Were airborne when the Emperor announced surrender, landed on carriers knowing the war was over. The pilots felt relief more than triumph. They had survived, had completed their missions, could go home. And so, the story comes full circle. Back to June 19th, 1944. Back to Alexander Vatu in his crippled Hellcat with the loose wingfold pins. Back to those 8 minutes when he shot down 6 Japanese aircraft and survived his greatest mission, flying an aircraft that was barely holding together. That moment crystallized everything the Hellcat represented, even broken, even crippled, even held together by nothing but American engineering and a pilot's will. It still brought him home, still let him complete his mission, still did its job. The photograph of Vatu with 6 fingers raised became more than just an image of victory. It became a symbol of what happened when industrial excellence met combat necessity, when systematic design met desperate courage, when the right weapon arrived at exactly the right moment in history. His grin in that photograph wasn't triumph, it was relief. The relief of survival, the relief of discovering that even when everything went wrong, the machine beneath him had been built well enough to compensate. That Grumman's engineers had overdesigned every specification, had built in safety margins that saved lives, had prioritized bringing pilots home above everything else. That philosophy changed warfare. Before the Hellcat, fighter design emphasized performance over protection. Speed and maneuverability were paramount. Pilot survival was secondary. The Hellcat inverted that equation. It proved that a pilot who survived today could fight tomorrow, could become experienced, could train the next generation. That continuity of experience, that institutional knowledge, that systematic approach to creating and preserving expertise became the foundation of American air power for the next 80 years. The Japanese never understood this. They built beautiful aircraft. The Zero was elegant, a masterpiece of lightweight construction and aerodynamic efficiency. But it was designed for short wars and decisive battles, for conflicts that would be won by superior skill and warrior spirit. When the war became industrial, when attrition mattered more than elegance, when the side that could replace losses faster would inevitably win, the Zero's philosophy collapsed. You couldn't train replacement pilots fast enough when your training system was designed for quality over quantity. You couldn't maintain aircraft when every plane was slightly different. You couldn't sustain operations when your logistics system assumed short supply lines and quick victories. The Hellcat was designed for exactly the kind of war that actually happened: long, grinding, industrial, a war of production and replacement, of logistics and training systems, of spare parts and fuel supplies, and the unglamorous mathematics of attrition. Grumman didn't set out to build the most maneuverable fighter or the fastest or the most elegant. They set out to build a fighter that could be produced in quantity, maintained in the field, flown by moderately trained pilots, and would bring those pilots home alive. That it achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio was almost incidental to its real purpose. The real purpose was survival. The kills were just what happened when survival was prioritized. The legacy extends beyond aviation. The Hellcat demonstrated principles that applied to every aspect of American military power. Protect your people, invest in training, create systems that preserve institutional knowledge, build equipment that's reliable and maintainable rather than cutting-edge and fragile. Accept that good enough produced in quantity beats perfect produced in limited numbers. These principles shaped American military doctrine through Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, and into the present day. They're why American forces still emphasize force protection, still rotate personnel through combat zones, still maintain elaborate logistics networks, still prioritize equipment reliability over maximum performance. The cost of learning these lessons was paid in blood over the Pacific. American pilots who died in Wildcats and Buffaloes in 1942 taught the Navy what didn't work. The survivors of those early defeats, men like Jimmy Thatch and Butch O'Hare, went home and institutionalized those lessons. The engineers at Grumman listened to combat pilots and designed accordingly. The result was the Hellcat, and the Hellcat validated every decision they made. By the numbers, the Hellcat was the most successful fighter aircraft in naval aviation history. 19-to-1 kill ratio, 5,223 victories, 66,000 sorties. But numbers can't capture the human element, can't convey what it meant to climb into a Hellcat, knowing it would probably bring you home, can't express the confidence that came from flying a fighter that was simply better than anything the enemy could field, can't quantify the psychological advantage of knowing your side held every card that mattered. Japanese pilots by 1945 knew they were flying obsolete aircraft, knew they were facing superior opponents, knew that taking off might be the last thing they ever did. That knowledge was as crippling as any physical limitation. Morale matters in combat, confidence matters, belief that you can win matters. The Hellcat destroyed Japanese morale as thoroughly as it destroyed Japanese aircraft. That may have been its greatest contribution to victory. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the moment when all of this came together, when the Hellcat proved its worth, when American training and logistics and industrial might demonstrated what they could accomplish. When Japan's last hope for a decisive victory died in the sky over the Philippine Sea, everything after was denouement. The war continued for another 14 months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan could still inflict casualties, could still force America to pay a price for victory, but couldn't change the fundamental equation, couldn't overcome the systematic advantages that had been demonstrated so decisively on June 19th and 20th. The dark blue fighter with the white star had ended the myth of Japanese air superiority forever, had proven that American industrial power, wedded to technical excellence and systematic training, could defeat any enemy, had shown that protecting your pilots let them survive to win the war rather than die gloriously in defeat. The Hellcat hadn't been the most elegant fighter, hadn't been the most maneuverable, hadn't been the fastest or the most beautiful, but it had been the most honest, had done exactly what it was designed to do, had brought pilots home. And in combat, as David McCampbell said, that's all that matters. The legacy lives on in every fighter aircraft that followed, in every doctrine that prioritizes force protection, in every training system that institutionalizes combat lessons, in every logistics network that keeps forces supplied and equipped. The Hellcat proved that systematic excellence beats individual brilliance, that industrial capacity beats warrior tradition, that protecting your people is the foundation of victory. These lessons, paid for in blood over the Pacific, shaped the American way of war for generations. And it all came down to one simple principle: bring your people home. Everything else follows from that. Design aircraft that protect pilots. Train pilots thoroughly so they survive their first combats and become veterans. Create systems that preserve and pass on combat knowledge. Build logistics networks that keep equipment operational. Accept that survival today enables victory tomorrow. The Hellcat embodied all of this, was the perfect expression of industrial warfare done right. 70 years after the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, aviation historians still study the Hellcat, still analyze its design decisions, still cite its kill ratio, still use it as the standard against which other fighters are measured, not because it was the fastest or the most advanced, but because it accomplished its mission more completely than any fighter aircraft before or since. It protected its pilots. It destroyed its enemies. It achieved air superiority. And it did all of this with such overwhelming effectiveness that the outcome was never really in question once it entered combat. The final accounting shows 12,275 Hellcats built, 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed, 270 Hellcats lost to enemy fighters. a 19-to-1 kill ratio that stands as the most dominant performance in the history of air combat. But beyond the numbers were the lives saved, the pilots who came home, the families who weren't shattered by telegrams, the institutional knowledge preserved, the victory achieved. That was the Hellcat's real legacy. Not just kills or statistics or records, but the demonstration that the right weapon, properly designed and properly employed, could change the course of history. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than a battle. It was validation. Proof that American industry could produce weapons that worked. That American training could create pilots who could use those weapons effectively. That American logistics could keep those weapons and pilots in the fight. That American doctrine, emphasizing systematic excellence over individual heroism, could defeat an enemy wedded to warrior tradition. The Hellcat was the instrument of that proof, the tool that made it possible, the weapon that destroyed Japanese naval aviation forever. And in the end, when the last Hellcat was finally retired, when the last combat pilot hung up his wings, when the final accounting was done, the verdict was clear. The F-6F Hellcat had been exactly what America needed exactly when America needed it, had performed its mission flawlessly, had brought its pilots home, had won the air war in the Pacific, had changed military aviation forever. Not bad for an honest airplane that just did its job.